Chapter 30. Can you believe we made it that far? The War to End War at 1917 and 1918. Let's get started. Two key points tonight. First of all, Wilson's idealism can be seen both in his attempt to avoid war, as well as his vision of peace after the war, something he referred to as peace without victory. And the federal government will play a direct and active role in the wartime economy, and this will only be for the duration of the war, but it certainly sets precedent moving forward. Now, the problem is that Germans are sinking merchant vessels in the Atlantic, and you have to understand why the Germans would do that, right? These merchant vessels are arming their opponent, and so therefore it's hurting them, and that makes sense to me. Wilson actually did ask to arm merchant vessels, and he was met with resistance from this, especially from a few senators in the Midwest. Shortly after that, the Zimmerman Note, or sometimes referred to as the Zimmerman Telegram, was actually confiscated and passed on to the United States. And what had happened was the German minister had proposed to Mexico that they should join the war effort on Germany's side. They could then attack the United States from the south. And in return, they would get the Mex concession back. And obviously, Americans are infuriated at this, but keep in mind that there was some tension between Mexico and the United States right before the outbreak of World War I. We were chasing Pancho Villa back and forth. Just in case you forgot, here is that Mex concession. So the whole southwest portion of our country. I wanted to show you this cartoon here in reference to neutrality, and the use of the American Pit Bull Terrier I think is used very well, because if you know Pit Bull Terriers, and I know that a lot of people have a lot of different opinions about them, but I did have one, and I can assure you that within the family they are more often than not very lovable dogs, very affectionate dogs, very kind dogs, and very docile dogs. But of course they have that other side, that aggressive side, and this unwillingness to back down. So this cartoon, which was made in 1915, shows me that the United States was neutral because they chose to be, not because they were afraid of these European enemies. Speaking of dogs, Dachshund? No, it's a Liberty pup. Remember, there is a strong sense of anti-German sentiment in the United States. Other things, hamburgers were Liberty steaks, I believe, and sauerkraut was Liberty cabbage. Again, trying to minimize this German cultural influence. All right, so as we said, Woodrow Wilson did not really want to go to war. He was anti-imperial, but after 4 more unarmed merchant ships had been sunk, he does ask Congress for war, and a few days later they do declare war on Germany. But again, he kept the ball in Germany's court. He really sort of made them press the issue and try to avoid war for as long as possible. And we try to think of 3 main causes. The Zimmerman Note does enrage Americans. American citizens, or especially in the Southwest, are upset about this. Obviously, the unrestricted submarine warfare is a major concern. We did talk about the Lusitania last chapter. But also remember that the Russian Revolution, this Bolshevik Revolution, sort of allowed the United States to join the side of the Allies without having to ally themselves with an autocratic government. So there's not only this of a more direct need to aid the Allies, it sort of is a political ideological kind of free pass to fight for democracy. And here is Vlad Lenin, the head of the Bolshevik Revolution. Remember, as I just said here, that Wilson is breaking this tradition of isolationism in the United States, right? George Washington recommended that a long time ago, so he needs to have a good reason to do that or sell to the people. And it's not a war of conquest, it's a war to end war, and it's a war to make the world safe for democracy. A chance for the United States to shape an international order in which democracy could flourish without fear of dictators. I'm going to talk now briefly about Wilson's 14 points. This will become the basis of his proposal for the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that will end World War I. And generally speaking, this is going to be sort of a just cause, right? He's not fighting for conquest, as I said. He's looking to create a peaceful Europe after the war. And this approach will kind of make Wilson this moral leader for the Allies as he advocates for things such as self-determination for oppressed minorities. Now, this is a challenge to traditional imperial goals, and he will be met with some resistance by the other members of the Allies as they negotiate this treaty. All right, don't write these down, but let's look at them to see just how progressive they were. Let's end secret treaties, right? This is a reaction to the entangling alliance system that broke down at the start of the war. Point 2 and 3 both are economic in nature. Let's have freedom of the seas, no blockades, no unrestricted submarine warfare, and in fact, let's have healthy trade by removing economic barriers. Trade, they say, is a sign of healthy relationships among nations, so keep that in mind. let's reduce armaments and, kind of avoid this escalated large-scale industrial war from repeating itself. And finally, let's rethink colonial claims and let's consider the interest of both the native people and the colonizers. Obviously, this is a reaction to that growing anti-imperial sentiment. This is 18 years or so after the Anti-Imperialist League was formed. By then, there are more people who are starting to rethink this whole concept of imperialism. This is the point that you want to write down, the 14th point, and in this, Woodrow Wilson proposes the famed League of Nations, and it is an international organization. It's sort of a global parliament, and Wilson dreamed that he would provide a system of collective security. This is going to be the point that is very difficult for Republicans especially, but many other people as well, to get on board with, because it brings in a lot of questions about the Monroe Doctrine and American sovereignty, and will in fact we be drawn into future European wars, something we've been afraid of from the onset. It is the precursor to the United Nations, as you can see here, because the League of Nations will fail. Let's change gears now. Let's talk about the wartime home front and informing the public and keeping them up to speed on things. And the United States government will actually hire a man here. His name is George Creel, and his job will be to head the Committee of Public Information. So he's going to be creating these propaganda posters, which will, of course, persuade the American people to do a variety of things. And I've got a few samples here for you. Here are some creepy children, right? But it is a school liberty garden, or here it just says a school garden. And think about the wonderful experience this is. Children are growing vegetables at school that they can then, of course, eat and perhaps even take home, which conserves food for the boys at the front. They're not going to the store to buy food. They're probably out there together in this wonderful, nice, sunny day, learning about, ecosystems and vegetation, and all the while learning about Woodrow Wilson and his very noble cause. It's a very patriotic thing to do. Individuals and families had liberty gardens at home, but you can see here that it made its way into public education. Everybody has seen this poster at some point in their life. I want you for the U.S. Army, Uncle Sam, right? We think maybe that's an American creation. It's not, because the English had John Bull, and it's a very similar message, as you can see here, although he's a bit more rotund. This is actually one of my favorite pieces of World War I propaganda. I use it every year. We're going to hit this in class, so if you want to go ahead and pause the video and give it a shot right now, you can do that. Just consider the message. What are they actually encouraging you to do? How are they trying to persuade you? And what tools are being used to encourage you to do this? Okay, so in a time of crisis and war, civil liberties are infringed upon, and that happens again here during World War I. There were over 8 million German Americans in the USA, and there's some concerns that they might be spying or trying to sabotage the country or the government or the military. So 2 laws are passed, the first of which is called the Espionage Act, and this is specifically about spying or aiding the enemy. And the second of which is called the Sedition Act, and this is speaking out or against the country. So if you're found guilty of one of those, you can find yourself with a hefty prison term and or fine. Socialist leader Eugene Debs and the Industrial Workers of the World leader William Haywood were both convicted under the Espionage Act. There's only one type of espionage, and for a bonus, if you can tell me what type of car that is, I'll give you a bonus point on your quiz. The Supreme Court ruled that freedom of speech could be infringed upon if that speech posed a clear and present danger, and this was ruled in the court case of Schenck v. U.S. in 1919. I think Schenck had distributed anti-draft pamphlets, and I think he was convicted under the Sedition Act. Clear and Present Danger, by the way, is a great Harrison Ford movie, but it's clearly not Indiana Jones. So the common thread that we're seeing here is that the government is actively trying to keep the country together, whether it's through propaganda or through eliminating dissent, keep everybody on board, keep everybody pro-war, and this is going to spill over into the economic world as well. So pre-war, the Civilian Council for National Defense is created, and they're going to look for problems in our economy, look for obstacles to economic mobilization for war. They also are going to increase the size of the Army and create a shipbuilding program. But in 1918, the War Industries Board is created, and it's led by a man named Bernard Baruch. And this will set precedent as to how the government will proceed in a wartime crisis and how they will take charge within the economy during that time. And it said in the pageant that the War Industries Board didn't have a tremendous amount of power at any given time, probably because it's only going to be around for less than a year or so. But again, this is setting some significant precedent moving forward. And also remember that there is a general fear of big government that reaches way back to the founding of our country. What is the size and scope of government? What's the role of government? Should they be in control of the economy? Generally speaking, we don't think that they should, but in a time of war, things change. Here is Bernard Baruch, by the way. Looks like a business type. In a similar sense, we have to make sure that labor is satisfied. And in 1918, the War Department uses a bit of fear. They use a threat here, and they say that if you're not employed, you are likely to be drafted. So there's this work or fight kind of mantra going around. The National War Labor Board will try to fix labor disputes before they escalate, before they hurt the war effort. Imagine if we had a major strike in the shipbuilding industry in 1918. That would be a problem. Now, some organizations, some unions, including the industrial workers of the world, who we haven't really spoken about much, although I did just mention them, they were quite militant and quite radical. They were referred to as the Wobblies. Some people criticize them as the I Won't Works, but they were often associated with this sort of radical behavior, and they often had jobs that had the worst conditions. So, to some extent, you can kind of understand why they may have felt as strongly as they did. On the right, you can see one of their membership cards here, which is also referred to as a red card. So there's a lot of association between this group and socialism as well. Fortunately for the war effort, the American Federation of Labor, another major labor union in the United States at this time, did support the war effort. Wartime inflation did reduce wage gains, and it led to thousands of strikes across the country. And remember that prices are going up significantly due to inflation. So even though your wages are increasing, your actual purchasing power has not gone up as much as it might seem on the surface. Here is an IWW poster. Again, kind of a little scary to look at that. One big union. There was a major strike in 1919 in the steel industry, and in fact it was the greatest strike in American history in terms of its size. Over 250,000 steel workers went on strike, and as you can imagine, they're looking for the right to organize and to collectively bargain, which is pretty reasonable by modern standards. Unfortunately for them, 30,000 African American strikebreakers were used, and that caused the strike to eventually collapse, which crippled the union movement for the time being. I do want to mention this Great Migration, which begins sort of during the war and does continue on into the 1920s. African Americans in large numbers are moving to northern cities, especially in search of jobs, and you can see that there are two waves of this in the 20th century here, both of which are around the time of the World Wars, but it only sort of kicks up the racial tension in the country, something we'll talk about in the upcoming chapters. Some suffrage groups, including the National Women's Party, led by Alice Paul, did protest the war, but most, including the National American Women's Suffrage Association, supported it. And women also took on new roles and, for example, worked in the defense industry while men were off fighting. And that may have led to the passage of the 19th Amendment. This suffrage amendment was something that Woodrow Wilson strongly supported. That makes sense, right? He is the moral idealist leader, so I understand that. There was also the Shepherd-Towner Maternity Act in 1921, which gave federal funds to instruct in maternal and infant health care. A bit more on the home front here. This is Herbert Hoover. He's going to be the head of the Food Administration during the war. Later, he'll become president. In fact, he's president when the stock market crashes in 1929, and probably unfairly, he's blamed for the Great Depression. But what he did really well, and what gave him a lot of support and favor in the public's eye, was he kind of promoted this idea of voluntary support. European nations during World War I were using rationing cards and sort of forcing this idea of restraint upon their people. He didn't do that. Instead, he advocated that you, as a family or an individual, you partake and participate in wheatless Wednesdays and meatless Tuesdays, and instead sort of go without with everybody else. Young kids eating apples were encouraged to eat the whole thing and be patriotic to the core. That's my favorite one right there. Congress also restricted the use of foodstuffs for manufacturing alcoholic beverages, which is going to be sort of a step closer to the 18th Amendment, which is passed just after the war, that, of course, being prohibition. Right, so European nations were running short on manpower, and the United States therefore had a real need to raise an army quickly, and a draft would be used to do that. All males between the ages of 18 and 45 were required to register for this, and one could not purchase an exemption as they could have during the Civil War, for example. Also, for the first time, women will be allowed to work in the armed forces. You can see a picture of some ladies here drilling. Now, keep in mind that women also work in the factory setting, and I had read an article on CNN that suggested that this experience of work and now military service sort of allowed women to cross over or break outside of gender stereotypes and perhaps led into this whole rebellious flapper movement of the 1920s. Now, there was a fear that people would resist the draft, and we've already talked about Shank and his encouraging people to resist the draft, but overwhelmingly people registered patriotically for this, and in fact, within a few months, the Army had over 4 million men. I think the pageant said there was like 400,000 conscientious objectors, so there were people who did avoid this, but generally speaking, overwhelmingly, people were patriotic in signing up for the military. So, as I said early on, 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution and their decision to pull Russia out of this capitalist war allowed Germany to redirect soldiers from the Eastern Front now to the Western Front, where much of this trench warfare that we think of with World War I actually took place. American troops will be sent all over to fight, and it did take some time for them to get there. Initially, they're used as replacements. And there were some shipping shortages that plagued the Allies, and so a lot of the war supplies actually did originate in Europe. Much of the food came from the United States. All right, so 1918, the Allied forces will be united under a French command, and they'll be fighting the German expansion on the Western Front. And at that time, 30,000 Americans will be sent to the French front lines. And this is the first significant engagement of American troops in a European war. Again, so pretty far from the advice of Washington and the American tradition of avoiding these European conflicts. In July 1918, German expansion was halted with the Second Battle of the Marne. That's a turning point in the Western Front. But the Americans decide to send their own American Expeditionary Force under the leadership of General John J. Pershing. He is the man who was in charge of chasing Pancho Villa back and forth across the Texas and Mexico border. He actually was assigned a front of 85 miles, and in this section, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive will be launched from September to November 1918, and this is the largest military battle to date. 1.2 million American troops are involved with this, and it puts Germany on their heels. Following the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Germany will surrender at the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918. The German Kaiser had fled to Holland. The United States' main contribution to the victory had been foodstuffs, munitions, credits, oil, and manpower. And remember that the Americans only fought in two major battles as a distinct unit. First at Saint-Mihiel, and the second, the Meuse-Argonne offensive. It was the prospect, sort of the threat of this never-ending supply of U.S. troops, and I would guess military supplies as well, rather than their actual military performance, which eventually convinced the Germans that they should give up. So Wilson's quite popular for his moral leadership and idealism, but he did make a mistake, and that was leading up to the congressional elections in 1918, when he directly appealed to the public and asked them to re-elect the Democratic members of Congress. This backfired, and in fact, he lost the congressional majority. He then goes on to Paris in person, which was something that presidents just hadn't done before, and in hopes of negotiating this treaty, and that infuriated Republicans as well. So the Big Four will go off and negotiate this treaty, and that's going to be Wilson of the United States, obviously, Premier Vittorio Orlando of Italy, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and the French Premier Georges Clemenceau. You don't see any members of the Central Powers present at that, no Germans, no Austro-Hungarians, and so that's kind of insulting. The Big Four do agree to include the creation of the League of Nations in this treaty, and as I said, that was Wilson's ultimate goal. And here they are. Wilson on the right, the taller man, he's got the ear of Georges Clemenceau, who looks to have had enough of Wilson's idealistic moral speech. And on the left, we have British Prime Minister being told a thing or two by the Italian Vittorio Orlando. So the League of Nations is going to be the point of contention in the USA, and there are two groups of Republicans who are opposed to this. There are the irreconcilables that are outright and vehemently opposed to the treaty, and then there are those who are led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, we call the reservationists, who would actually support it if the League of Nations was removed from the treaty itself. Now, the rest of the Big Four had a more unified support at home. Don't forget that Wilson's going to lose the majority in Congress. And in Europe, the motives that they have for the treaty are more in line with traditional imperial motives and values. The Treaty of Versailles is going to be signed in 1919, and the Germans are outraged at this. There is a great deal of vengeance in this treaty, more so than reconciliation. For example, Germany is forced to pay a tremendous amount of money in reparations. They also have some significant and severe restrictions on their military, specifically their navy and the submarines. And finally, they're going to have to accept this war guilt clause and basically say that the war was entirely their fault. Most of the 14 points that Wilson proposed were left out of the treaty, and he did compromise this as an attempt to salvage the League of Nations. He did also liberate a tremendous amount of people, as you can see here. This map shows the pre-war boundaries, and you can see the empires of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Obviously, after the war, the map will literally be redrawn, and these new nations will be created based on ethnic lines. That was a part of Wilson's 14 points. So the pageant suggests that the Republicans didn't really want to defeat the treaty. Instead, they wanted to Republicanize it so they could therefore perhaps use it to propel them into the presidency following Wilson. They could claim credit for it, to say it another way. Wilson was pretty adamant about it the way it was, and so he traveled the country to appeal directly to the people, as he had done as governor of New Jersey. He did receive some mixed reactions of speeches, and unfortunately for Wilson, he did suffer a stroke while on tour. So Senator Lodge, who he and the president, by the way, had this ongoing conflict, he is going to come up with 14 reservations to the Treaty of Versailles, and his goal is to protect American sovereignty. And again, this fear is that if we join the League of Nations, are we going to be able to say no? Are we going to be able to resist, or are we going to have sort of our hand dealt to us by this European-dominated organization? That's a real fear for Americans. Wilson's very opposed to the reservations. But the Senate does vote on it and reject it twice. Therefore, the Treaty of Versailles will be defeated in the United States. And here is Henry Cabot Lodge, nicknamed Slim. European nations will sign the Treaty of Versailles and the USA will not. And 1920 is going to be an election year for president, and so this issue of the League of Nations will carry over. The Republicans will run Senator of Ohio, Warren G. Harding, and he'll have vice presidential candidate, Governor of Massachusetts, Calvin Coolidge, on the ticket with him. They do kind of straddle the fence a little bit and appeal to both pro-League and anti-League members and sentiment within the party. Democrats will run Governor James M. Cox with FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, as vice presidential nominee, and their platform was very much pro-League of Nations. Warren Harding will win the election in 1920, and this will be ultimately the death of the League of Nations. And here he is seen here at the head of the table with his cabinet, a group that we call the Ohio Gang. We'll talk more about them in the next chapter. So after World War I, America will return to isolationism, or as Warren G. Harding campaigned, it returned to normalcy, and it'll be very much a business-driven administration, and we'll see a shift back to a consumer economy and a decade full of a variety of conflicts, which we'll return to next chapter. But as a result of this American isolationism, the world will move closer to another world war, and obviously it's one that we also cannot ignore and cannot be isolated from. That's it for tonight. A lot of information in Chapter 30, but we are about 3/4 of the way through the American pageant and still going strong. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or just ask me tomorrow in class. Take care.